Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Platform by Dr. Sushma SIngh. Today we start Unit 2 Democracy, and our topic is Introduction the Introduction the Origins of the Democratic Ideals. In 1992, 2,500 years of democracy were enthusiastically celebrated all over the world. This was an unusual celebration because while anniversaries of the statesmen, revolutions, and the founding of the nations are quite commonly celebrated, no other political ideals has ever been celebrated in this way. Also, democracy in the modern world is quite different from the democracy as it was practiced in ancient Greece 2500 years ago. The democratic ideas and practices which we are here concerned belong to the modern world. But it would be useful to briefly note the chief features of the democracy in the city-state of Athens, widely considered to be the most stable, enduring, and model form of democracy in Greece in ancient times. The word democracy itself is of Greek origin. The Greek word demokratia is a combination of the words demo, meaning the people, and krioto, means rule. This gives democracy its meaning as a form of government in which the people rule, whether directly through personal participation or indirectly through elected representatives. The main difference between the ancient and the modern democracies, of course, is in the way in which the people were defined. In the ancient Greek polity, the demos was rather restrictively defined and notably excluded three main categories of persons: the slaves, women, and metics, the foreigners who lived and worked in the city state. This meant that barely a quarter of the total population were members of the citizen body. Nevertheless, the direct participation of the 40,000 strong citizen body was no mean achievement. The actual career of the Athenian democracy was fairly troubled, as aristocrat generals and the demagogues made periodic attempts to control power. Their contempt for the poor, described as the mob or the rebel, finds epochs in the modern world, where democracy was achieved through struggle and against considerable odds. Indeed, the struggle for democracy everywhere and throughout history has been simultaneously a struggle against political inequality based on and justified by the inequalities of birth and wealth. At its best, however, Athenian democracy conveys an impressive picture of the direct participation by citizens in the assembly, which deliberated and took decisions on all policy matters and met on as many as 300 days in a year. Citizens also participated directly in the government as they were chosen by lot to serve in official, administrative, and judicial positions. Now let us move to the next point, historical background. Democracy has been described as one of the characteristic institutions of modernity, and as such it was the result of a complex and intervened processes of the ideological, social and economic change in Britain. This change was signaled by the Industrial Revolution that began in the middle of the 18th century. While in France and America it was launched by the political revolutions in the last quarter of the same century. Britain is regarded as the first modern democracy because, in the aftermath of the Civil War in the 17th century, royal absolutism was brought to an end, and powers were transferred from the crown to the two houses of parliament, of which one, the House of Commons, was an elected chamber, though the franchise continued to be highly restricted, based on ownership of property, control of executive had effectively passed to a loose coalition of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, such that political conflict was henceforth peacefully conducted between the competing elites. It was only in the 19th century that the expansion of the suffrage took place, beginning with the enfranchisement of the upper middle classes in the Reform Act of 1832. This was followed by the gradual extension of the franchise to the working classes, largely as a response to the pressure of political struggles by the working class and the radical movements like Charitism. By the last quarter of the 19th century and three reforms acts later, about two-thirds of the male population stood enfranchised. It was, however, not until 1929 that the women secured the right to vote, and universal adult suffrage was fully achieved only in 1948, when plural voting was abolished in favor of the principle of the one person, one vote. In France, the more radical tradition of democracy was inaugurated by the Revolution of 1789, with its steering call of the liberty, equality, and fraternity, and its emphasis on the principle of the popular sovereignty. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen proclaimed the rights of personal liberty, freedom of thoughts and religion, security of property, and political equality as the natural and impeccable entitlements not merely of French citizens but of mankind at large. Initially, the Revolutionary Constitution of 1791 established something akin to universal male suffrage, and even the property requirement for the right to vote was low enough to exclude only domestic servants, virgins, and beggars. Thus, 4 million male citizens won the right to vote in 1791. But 4 years later, some more restrictive property requirements were introduced, bringing down the number of voters to just 1 lakh prosperous taxpayers. Universal male suffrage was reinforced only after the Revolution of 1848 and universal adult franchise only a century later in 1946, when women won the right to vote. In the United States of America, too, The advance of democracy in the aftermath of the Civil War was restricted to white men and the enfranchisement of women, as also of indigenous and black people were not achieved until the 20th century. Nevertheless, the Declaration of the Independence 1776 was the document that simultaneously affected the legal creation of the United States of America and that of the democracy in that country. Though slavery continued to be practiced until the mid 19th century, the American Revolution did give the modern world its first democratic government and society. Hereditary power of the monarchy and the aristocracy alike were overthrown as a republican government, in which all citizens were at least notionally equal, was put in place. An important institutional mechanism of separation of power between the three branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, was also affected, making it difficult for any one branch to exercise arbitrary or untrammeled power. The political ideas of the Levelers, John Locke, and the Tom Paine, and the documents like the French Declaration of Right of Man 1789 and the American Declaration of Independence 1776 expressed the important ideas and principles that have underpinned democracy in the modern world. These writings and documents are also often seen as the charters of liberalism, and liberalism was indeed an important handmaiden of democracy at this time. This was why it is not surprising that the beginning of democratic theory are indistinguished by a strong emphasis on the concept of liberty rather than the concept of equality with which it later came to be identified. As their name indicates, the Levelers in the 17th century England advanced a radical conception of popular sovereignty and civil liberties, interrogating property ownership as the basis for the political rights. They advocated a nearly universal male suffrage, though echoing the ancient Athens, servants and criminals apart from women were to be excluded. John Locke's second thesis on government 1681 is an important source book of the classical liberal ideas. In this work, Locke presents an account of the hypothetical state of nature, governed by a law of nature which mandates that no individual ought to harm another in life, health, liberty, or possessions. The natural equality of man, stemming not from any equality of the endowment in the terms of virtue or excellence, but from the fact that they are all equal creatures of God, gives them the equal rights to freedom. Though this state of nature is governed by a law of nature and that endorses these rights, there is no agency to administer and enforce this law. Therefore, to prevent others from the invading their rights or to exact retribution for such invasions, men will enforce the law as they interpret it. In a state of nature that is largely characterized by peace and mutual assistance, the absence of such an agency contains endless possibilities for conflict, and these are of chief inconveniences of the state of nature, which is therefore transcended through a social contract. This social contract, founded in the consent of every individual, is the basis of the legitimate government. Civil law must now conform to the eternal rule that is natural law, and thus the purpose of political society and of the government is the preservation of the life, liberty, and property of the individuals. As law, according to the supplements, this account with the defense of private property. If the government fails to discharge the purposes for which it was created, the people have the right to resist and replace it. It is this statement of the core principles of the classical liberalism, individualism, popular sovereignty, and the limited government that provided the foundation for liberal democracy. These principles were also celebrated in the American Declaration of Independence 1776, which followed the Locke in describing as natural and inalienable the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the last widely interpreted as the euphemism for property. The continued exclusion of slaves and women from the category of those who possess such rights is only one example of the contradiction between the universalism of liberal principles and the selectivity of liberal practices. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man 1789 reflected the republican spirit of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In idealizing citizenship by presenting individuals as public spirited members of a community. For Rousseau, however, representative government simply was not good enough, and the only form of free government was directly democracy in which citizens would participate directly. Of course, Rousseau was aware that the gross inequalities of wealth as well as large political communities were obstacles to popular sovereignty, while liberty, welfare, and the public education in the context of a small city state provided the ideal condition for democracy. However, it has now come to be recognized that the link between the liberalism and democracy is not a necessary one. Liberal democracy may be historically specific form of democracy based on a culturally specific theory of individualism. It combines liberalism as a theory of the state with democracy as a form of government. As such, for the societies that attach greater significance to the community than to the individual, the democratic part of liberal democracy, such as free election and freedom of speech, may be adopted without the liberal component. It has thus become possible today to speak not only for different paths to democracy but also of different ways of being democratic or even being differently democratic. The 20th century saw an unparalleled extension of democracy in terms of both its inclusiveness as well as its spatial expansion, beginning with the extension of the suffrage to women in the older Western democracies and ending with the dismantling of the apartheid in South Africa. Democracy in the 20th century became more inclusive. This phenomena has been described in terms of waves of democratization. The democratization of many countries in Europe in the 19th century is viewed as the first wave of democratization. The second wave is dated to the period following World War I, when many countries of the Europe, including those of the Scandinavia, became democratic. The third wave of democracy came after the Second World War, when new democracies were established in the countries like Germany and Italy after the collapse of Nazism and fascism, and following decolonization in the 1950 and 1960. Democracy was eagerly adopted by most of new nations of Asia and Africa. The fourth wave of democratization saw a return to democracy in post-communist Eastern Europe, as well as in many countries of Latin America that has turned their backs to democracy. Here we want to wind up the lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.